Kent is a local beekeeper. He and his wife Bernadette own Main Street Marketplace here in Waupaca. And Kent actually just got back from his trips to Nicaragua, so he'll tell you more about that tonight. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Not going to use a mic or anything like that. Again, I'm from Waupaca here, and my presentation is on beekeeping. And when Tracy asked me to speak, I kind of didn't know how to cover it kind of from a historical standpoint, or it's kind of a broad subject, but I'll kind of go through a number of different things. I started dancing bear apiary about 40 years ago. I lived in Manawa at the time. I've been doing bees and honey ever since then. And my wife and I own Main Street Marketplace downtown, and that's where I sell most of my honey through is Main Street Marketplace. I do sell some to other beekeepers, but most of it we sell through the store. Quick overview of what I'm going to go through tonight is a bit of a history of modern beekeeping. Keeping bees in Waupaca, that kind of goes through what my year of keeping bees is like, and problems facing the honeybees and other pollinators. I get a lot of questions, and you hear a lot on the news today about what's happening to the bees, why are the bees disappearing, and then I'll end up with a little bit on the Nicaragua bee project also. So first of all, I'm just going to start with a little background on our bee. The bee we keep is Apis mellifera, and it's a very docile bee. It's not very aggressive. We keep them in hives like that. This is not the bee we keep. This is not our honeybee. Get a lot of calls in the summer. People say, "Come, save these bees in my house. Can you put them in your beehive?" And they can't do anything with wasps. I don't like wasps. Wasps are carnivorous. They do eat meat. You can see the pincers on the front of this guy, and they can be aggressive. In the fall when you have your picnics, the wasp numbers are increasing. Their food source is decreasing, and they come after your picnics. The honeybee only has a tongue. And the honeybee, she drinks nectar out of flowers and collects pollen on her back legs. And the nectar is for the carbohydrates, and the pollen is for the protein source. And mostly we don't eat pollen. They use the pollen to raise young bees with. Again, our honeybee, it's fuzzy, cute, and it's not aggressive. You'll probably never be stung by a honeybee. The only way you're probably going to be stung is if you're barefoot in some Dutch clover or dandelions or something. They're very, very not aggressive. Our honeybee in this part of the world. Again, not our honeybee. A quick history of modern beekeeping. Modern beekeeping kind of starts around the 1850s, but prior to that, honeybees are not native to North America. They were brought over by the settlers from Europe as a source of honey, of a sweetener. And as the settlers moved west, the Indians called them the white man's fly. They could tell when the white men were moving further and further west because the bees would precede them. Honeybee colonies swarm. That's their natural way of making sure that they are going to survive. They raise a new queen, and the old queen leaves with the young bees, and the new queen stays with the old bees. And that's how they split their hives, and that's how they continue to survive. And so as the white settlers were moving west, the bees continued in front of them. And the first sightings of bees that were in the history books were in this area, were in Clintonville on the banks of Honey Creek by Mr. Clinton, who saw them in about 1875. And there were also some bee trees found near New London. They probably preceded that time frame here in Wisconsin because there were beekeepers prior to that in Wisconsin. Modern beekeeping kind of started in 1852 with the Reverend Lorenzo Langstroth. He patented the Langstroth beehive. What he found is that he discovered the bee space. There were a number of people that really knew about it, but he's the one that perfected the bee space. The bee space is about 3/8 of an inch. And what he noticed is that if you built a hive where the combs were 3/8 of an inch apart, the bees would not build bridge comb between the combs, and you could remove the combs and manipulate the hive. Here's a picture of a movable hive. Keith Penny, who's here, this is Keith showing off his beautiful hive. The combs can be removed. You can manipulate the hive. You can check to make sure the queen's laying, and you can remove the combs and extract the honey out of the combs. So this was really the start of modern beekeeping. And this is a Langstroth hive. We're still using them today. Basically, no changes from when Reverend Langstroth developed them. Currently, beekeeping in the U.S., there's about 1,500 commercial beekeepers, and I would say a commercial beekeeper is someone who keeps more than 500 hives. But nowadays, typically, they have between 1,000 to 2,000 minimum, and a lot of them have as many as 10,000. Some have 20,000. There's even a couple that have more 50,000 hives. But that's the commercial beekeepers. I'm considered a sideline beekeeper. I have about 200 colonies. I don't rely on it for my major part of my income. and there's about 10,000 sideline beekeepers in the U.S., and about 200,000 hobbyists. And this number may be a little bit low with all the press that bees have gotten in the last couple of years. There's probably a few more, maybe 250,000 hobbyists now in the United States. In Wisconsin, okay, so in Wisconsin, in 1864, the Wisconsin Honey Producers was formed. This kind of gets along that timeline of the history of modern beekeeping. Langstroth developed the hive, patented it in the 1850s, and immediately it took off as a business. The Wisconsin Honey Producers is still in effect. It's been going ever since 1864. I'm currently the president of the Wisconsin Honey Producers. We have about 500 members, and we protect or we represent beekeepers and honeybees in Wisconsin. The American Bee Journal, again, 1860. It's that same time frame of modern beekeeping. The American Bee Journal started in 1860, and it's the longest continually published magazine in the United States. This particular cover is from April of 1985, and it was their first color cover in 125 years. And I'm kind of proud because they're my pictures on the cover, pictures I took in Alabama in the early 80s of beekeeping in Alabama. But that publication still goes to this day, and it's kind of interesting how it's been carried on. Some of you may know the Waupaca Historical Society's film they have of 1938. Someone in 1938 went around town and took film of local associations and local businesses, and back then honey was represented in that film. A man by the name of Charles Genetti, who lived over on Ware Street across from Paul's Concrete, had honeybee hives. Here he's shown with a 5-pound tin of honey and a comb honey on top, and too much hasn't really changed. From the 75 years when modern beekeeping started to 1938, nothing had really changed at all. Now the only difference is I sell my honey in glass, and I put my comb honey in plastic containers to better protect it. Every beekeeper has a mentor. Every good beekeeper should have a mentor. My mentor was Bob Lynn from Manawa. This is a picture of him in 1976 in front of his hives. Some of you might know Bob. He was quite a nice man, quite a character. And he was good enough to teach me beekeeping, let me dive into his hive, and kind of take over his hives. Again, the tools haven't changed much in 150 years. When I'm out there working bees, I'm basically using the same tools, and everything's the same as it was back in the mid-1800s. The smoker now is made out of stainless steel. Back then they were galvanized, but a beekeeper from 1860 would recognize it immediately and could start working the hives. The hive tool that's leaning up against it here, same thing. Hasn't changed much in 150 years. Neither is the bee suit. We still wear bee suits, veils to protect our faces. This is my wife Bernadette. She was helping me move hives one night, and you don't always need to wear a full bee suit, but when you're moving hives at night, bees like to crawl, and you like to make sure that every little thing is kind of make sure it's tight. Bee yards are places, locations where you keep beehives. I have about 8 bee yards around Waupaca, all within 6 miles of Waupaca, and you pick a bee yard based on where you think is going to be a good location for the bees to gather nectar and honey. And also you have some things you got to watch for. Like this yard faces east. So in the morning when the sun comes up, the sun hits the hives and gets the bees up early in the morning, gets them working so that they can start gathering honey earlier. And as the day progresses, the shade from the trees to the west gives them a little bit of coolness. The trees to the west also protect them from the winter winds, because when you winter hives in Wisconsin, you got to protect those hives from those winter winds. Because in the winter, the bees do not hibernate; they are active in those hives, and if you don't protect them, they will die. Bears, a lot of bears in the Waupaca area, a constant battle. All my yards have double bear fences around them, and they're electrified, and bears don't like electricity. You really couldn't build a bear-proof fence because a bear could get through almost anything, but they don't like electricity. A little taste of electricity, they hopefully will move on. And sometimes they don't. And they get through the fences, and they'll tear the hives apart, and they'll carry the boxes way off into the woods to get away from the beehives and the bees so they can eat the honey and the brood in peace. And they like the honey, but they like the brood in the hive even more. That's the young larva and pupa in the hive, because that's a source of protein for the bears. And so they'll go out, take those combs way out in the woods, smash the boxes apart, and eat the honey and brood. This is a yard I have right over by the Fox Valley Technical College over here on the east side of town. And 3 years in a row, this yard's been hit by a bear. This last year, what it did is it dug 8 times before finally the 9th time it successfully dug underneath the fence and got into the bee yard. And he carried the hives out into a cornfield and tore them up. Now I've done some things that hopefully this is bear proof. We'll see this year. A little bit about my beekeeping year and how a beekeeping year goes for beekeepers in Wisconsin. My beekeeping year basically starts in September. This is a picture of a beekeeper, not me, but another beekeeper. And what we're doing here is feeding hives. After you harvest honey in the fall, the first thing you want to do is make sure that the bees have enough honey to get through winter or carbohydrates to get through winter. They need about 70 pounds of honey to get through the winter. So hives that don't have that much weight, you feed them sugar syrup. And what these are pails that have holes in the lid, little holes, and we fill them with sugar syrup. We invert them over the hive, and the bees can then drink the sugar syrup out of the pails, and they store that sugar syrup as honey in the hives. And that keeps them alive through the winter. After we're done feeding them, they're all up to weight, we wrap them. How I wrap my hives is I push 2 hives together, and I have, let's see here. I have insulation around the back 3 sides, and the front here is not insulated. I slide this corrugated opaque plastic box over the hive, and then it faces south, so this front area kind of acts as a solar heater and warms the hives up on very cold, clear winter days. And then that's how it looks when it's all wrapped up for winter. Once it's wrapped up, I pretty much don't have much to do with the hive until about February. What I was saying earlier is that bees really don't winter, they don't hibernate. Wasps and insects, they will, most of them will die off, and the queens will try to go somewhere and survive the winter. But bees are active all winter long in the hives. When it's 30 degrees below zero outside, it'll be 90 degrees in the middle of that cluster of bees. The bees go into a cluster, and the ones on the outside act as heater bees. They actually disconnect their wings, and they vibrate, and they create heat, and it'll be 90 degrees in the middle of that cluster if it's 30 degrees below zero outside. If I open the hive up in the middle of winter, the bees will fly out, but then they fall to the ground because they get paralyzed from the cold weather. So that's why you want to protect the bees as much as possible to not put as much stress on them, not as much work for them to keep the hive warm. January, that's what the bees look like. They're pretty much covered in snow, and they're just fine like that, protected from the wind. It's a time of the year where we do work in my wood shop. We'll build hives, paint hives, repair equipment. These are my 2 boys working on hives in my shop in February. There's kind of a parallel winter story to beekeeping in the United States and even in Wisconsin here. Most of my hives go to California in the winter. So in November, what we do is we load the hives on small trucks like this. We go out to our little yards around town here, we load them onto small trucks like this, and then we put 400 hives on a semi-truck like this, cover them with a screen net, and drive them out to California. They go into holding yards in California. And the reason for that is almond pollination. Almond pollination is kind of the tail that wags the whole beekeeping industry now because there's so much money in almond pollination. California has about 1 million acres of almonds, and they require 2 hives per acre of almonds to pollinate them. There's only 2.6 million colonies in the United States. So of the 2.6 million colonies in the United States, 2 million of them go to California, to just a relatively small area, to pollinate almonds. It's an incredible feat of logistics that I send my bees out with another beekeeper, and there's 2 million hives going to these holding yards, and I get my same hives back in the spring. Same exact hives, same numbers. I've never lost a hive. It's an amazing logistics feat. And right now, as we speak, this is what my hives look like in California. The almonds are in full bloom right now, and my bees are pollinating almonds. The big advantage to this is, there's 2 big advantages. One big advantage is my hives are raising young bees, and they're growing in size. They're gathering pollen and nectar from the almonds, and they're building up in strength. So when they come back here, they're very strong, and I can split those hives, and they're very healthy. The other side of that story is the money. Typically, when beekeepers move hives into apples or watermelons or blueberries, they get about $60 per hive for rental fees for that hive to be there. With almonds, they pay $200 per hive because they need all those hives in California for almonds. If they don't have them, they're not going to get an almond crop, and the almond crop is a very, it was worth a lot of money. So that's why so many bees go to California. I guess the downside of that is we're putting all our bees in one area, but that kind of happens anyway with pollination needs around the country. We need bees to pollinate orchards and blueberries and so forth, so it's still happening. It's just that this is on a little bit larger scale. But the upside is it's profitable for beekeepers to keep colonies healthy and strong. Without this money coming into the beekeeping industry, because of the challenges facing bees, we would probably have 250,000 hives instead of 2.6 million hives. So as the year progresses with pollination around the United States, my bees go from Wisconsin, they go right to California. A lot of bees go to California and they stay on the West Coast pollinating crops on the West Coast. Some bees in the winter go down to Texas where they split hives in Texas so they can send them to California. Most all the hives end up in this area of the country in the summer to gather a honey crop. And then there's also Florida and the citrus, and then there's a lot of pollination on the East Coast with blueberries and apples and things like that. So bees are constantly moving all over the country. And part of the bad part about that, again, is the stress in the bees, but it really does keep us with a healthy amount of hives in order to do the pollination that we need for our fruits and vegetables to be in the store. After the bees are done this month, next month, they'll be coming back to Wisconsin. This is a picture of my bees arriving last March back in Wisconsin here. They bring them back on the trucks again, deliver them to my yard. And we go through the hives and we start assessing how the hives look. This is a very healthy hive here. This is all brood that's ready to hatch out. And this came from a very, very strong, good hive. And we go through and find the queens and we make splits. And what we do there is we have hives that don't live throughout the year. The hives are constantly dying. Typically through history, about 30% of hives die throughout the year. They go queenless or they starve or something goes wrong and they die. So what we're doing here is we're making splits to replenish the bees that have died off. These all are individual little splits for each of these boxes, and we'll take these out to another bee yard, put them in full-size hives, and they will start to grow in size. It's a great time to be in the bee yard. The bees are gentle. It's springtime. They're gathering nectar and pollen from the poplar trees, from the maple trees, from the dandelions, and it's just a great time. I mean, it looks kind of scary when you look at all the bees in the air, but it is really a nice time to be in the bee yard. I mean, to a non-beekeeper, I'm sure that looks a little bit interesting, but another way we stock hives in Wisconsin is we buy packages of bees. And in certain areas of the country, like California or the southern states, they have hives that have more bees than they need. So they'll shake the excess bees into a screen cage like this. There's about 3 pounds of bees in there and about 10,000 bees, and they'll add a queen. And then they'll send that package up here to Wisconsin, and we'll dump that package. You can see here, Keith actually is dumping a package of bees into this hive here, and we stock that hive with the bees. We release the queen in there, and that package starts to the queen starts to lay eggs and starts to grow, get stronger and stronger. These were all new hives. These are probably all packages. They're 1-story boxes. They're relatively small hives. That's how the bees would look in early spring. And then by May, those bees have filled the boxes completely. The queen has laid a lot of extra bees and they've hatched out, and those hives get strong enough that we add a second box. That second box, this first box and the second box is called the hive. That's where the bees stay year round. That's where the queen lays her eggs. That's where we make sure they have enough honey for the winter to get through winter in. And then we come in May and June and we add what's called supers. And supers are boxes that go on top of the hives, and that's where they're going to store the excess honey that we're going to eventually harvest, hopefully. And so hopefully by June or July, our hives look like this. And those bottom 2 boxes, that's the basic hive. And then these are all supers on top that the bees hopefully have stored honey in that we're going to come back and harvest. And you can imagine this is a time of year when you don't want a bear to get in there and start tearing the yard up. Just a review of what honey is and nectar is. The bees collect nectar from flowers. Nectar is about 80% water. So they store that nectar in the cells, and then they fan their wings to create an airflow over the honey, the nectar, to reduce it to about 18%. And when it's reduced to 18%, they put the capping over the cell. It's like a wax capping on top of the cell, and that's an indication that the honey is at the right moisture content that it's going to keep, that'll keep for them, but it's ready for me to harvest. Kind of going back here. You can see here there's a little bit of capping on top there, but most of the cells are all open. So when it's ready to harvest, it'll look like that. So then we bring a machine that's called a bee blower. It's basically just a blower. And this is my son blowing bees out of the boxes. And we blow all the bees out of the boxes. And they slide down this little chute here, and they end up in front of the hive, and they just crawl right back in the hive. And you go in and harvest the honey boxes. You pull the box off, you blow the bees out of it, and load it on a truck. And most of the time, you're out of the yard before the bees ever know what happened. And you know, they crawl back in the hive, and I'm sure they're wondering what happened to their honey, but we're gone. And then we bring it back to the honey house, and this is a machine that extracts the honey. And we put the combs in here, and if you remember, there was those wax cappings on the combs. We put them through this machine here, and there's knives that vibrate back and forth and cut those wax cappings off the combs. And then the combs come down the line here. We load them into this machine, which is an extractor, which is basically a centrifuge. It spins the combs around and around, and honey flies out of the cells. Honey goes down into a sump area here, where it's pumped into tanks, and it's filtered through just a nylon cloth, and it goes into tanks and settles out. Here's a picture, if you can see here along the edge here, where the honey's flying out of the cells as the combs go around and around. It's just basically a centrifuge. And then we put the honey in 60-pound pails to store it, and subsequently we bottle it as we need it, you know, for the store. We put it in plastic bears or glass jars. I do a lot of creamed honey. Creamed honey is basically granulated honey, and then I'll add some flavorings. I can do either a plain cream honey or lemon or cinnamon or orange. And honey naturally granulates. It turns into sugar. Nothing's wrong with it. You can reliquefy it again by just warming it up. But what this honey is it's finely granulated honey, so it spreads real nice on toast or other things you want to spread it on. I also do a lot of comb honey. And comb honey is just basically combs cut out of the boxes. You get about 4 of these from each comb in the box, and then we put them in plastic boxes. And ironically, most of my comb honey goes to Hong Kong. We import a lot of cheap Chinese honey into the United States, or I shouldn't say we do. The big companies do that, use it in, you know, products, factory-made products. And we import the cheap honey from China, and then we send the real expensive good stuff back to China. But it's a market that they really appreciate the good quality honey. And I do sell a lot of this here in the United States too. And then those wax cappings I cut off, those get drained out and I melt them down and turn it into just blocks of beeswax. And most of my beeswax goes to one company that makes like lip balms and body lotions and soaps and so forth. We actually sell those products in our store, but they sell them all over the country. And they pay a premium price for my wax because they know who they're dealing with. They know how my bees are taken care of with the chemicals I don't use, you know, that it's pure beeswax and not contaminated. So they know, they pay a little bit more to work with a beekeeper they know. And then my beekeeping year starts over again. So that's kind of the cycle of the whole year. Why are the bees dying? We get a lot of questions about that, and it's in the news a lot. You know, the bees are dying, the pollinators are dying. A number of reasons. There's not just one reason, there's a number of them. Right now, the insecticides we're using are called neonicotinoids, and they're systemic pesticides that are coatings on seeds and they grow into the plant. And when that insecticide grows into the plant, it kills bugs that are going to eat that plant. So we're putting a lot of these insecticides into the environment. Most all of this is on corn and soybeans. Bees don't work corn or soybeans. But still, having all these chemicals in nature, they're getting into the bees and they're affecting how long the bees live. In the summertime, the bees live about 42 days before they work themselves to death. The most productive part of their life is the last 7 days of their life. That's when they become foraging bees and go out and collect nectar. Well, with all the chemicals and all the problems we're having, the bees are living shorter life. So if they're dying a week early, they basically lose the productive part of their lifespan. That's one of the problems we're facing. You can see neonicotinoid use. In 1994, there was hardly anything being used, and now it's just widespread all over the United States. It's hard to buy seeds that are not coated with neonics. Even when you buy them for your gardens, you'll notice they're colored, and they have that pesticide on the seed. And then there's also herbicides and fungicides that are being used, and all this is getting into nature, and it's really affecting how much chemicals the bees can handle, and it's shortening their life and putting stress on the hives. Another reason is lack of forage. When I started beekeeping back in the 70s, there were a lot of small fields, 10-acre fields, 20-acre fields, and between those fields there were fence rows. And in those fence rows there were shrubs and trees and plants and wildflowers the bees could collect things off of. Not only the honeybees, but the butterflies and the native wild bees could gather a lot of forage from between the fields. This is a shot from just north of town here, and you can see back in 1994 where there was, smaller fields here. There was some, fence rows here and here, and there were a lot of wild areas. And if you jump forward, you can see now in 2015 where a lot of those fence rows have been taken out. You kind of go back and kind of see where we've lost a lot of the wild areas. And that makes farming a lot more efficient, and there's good reasons for that. The monocrop farming we do makes for extremely efficient, cheap food, and feeds a good part of the world with inexpensive food, so there's advantages to it. But the big downside is that we're losing forage for not only our honeybees, but for our native pollinators and for our butterflies. You've heard about the monarch butterflies, how they used to cover so many acres in Mexico when they went there every winter, and now it's just down to just several acres. The honeybees and other bees also have diseases and parasites. Particularly the honeybee, we have the varroa mite. And you can see on this bee here, there's 2 varroa mites on this bee. This varroa mite came into the United States in the 1980s. And that varroa mite, if a honeybee was the size of a human, it would be like the size of a fist. So if you put a fist on your chest, that'd be like having a mite the size of a fist on your chest. And what it does is it opens up a wound so it can suck the blood and the fat bodies out of the bee to survive. But then it also opens up this wound that viruses get in through that wound. So it's a number of things that are facing pollinators, honeybees, native bees, and butterflies. There's the varroa, the parasites that live on, the viruses that get into them, the mono crop culture we have with big cornfields, big soybean fields, and then all the chemicals that we're using. So it's kind of all those things working together is why we're seeing problems with bees. Getting back to the almonds, that's one of the good things about the almonds is it's pouring so much money into the bee industry that we have enough bees to do the pollination that we need to have done. And there's a lot of work going on to overcome some of these things. We're not just, the future is not so dark. There are things that we're hopefully doing better and better each year to overcome some of these problems. Moving on to Nicaragua. The Nicaragua Bee Project is a nonprofit corporation, and it was formed by 2 guys initially, Marty Havlik on the right and Dr. Michael Bauer from town here on the left. And Marty Havlik was a professor with UW Extension. He was the head of the UW Extension for the whole state of Wisconsin. He just retired last year, and Dr. Bauer was a beekeeper. And both these guys had done a lot of work overseas with training beekeepers in Haiti and different places, and they would go train beekeepers. But then they'd come back and the people they trained were not beekeepers. They had no way of becoming beekeepers because it takes money to become a beekeeper. So they formed this nonprofit organization to gather money, to take donations. And what we do now is we go into Nicaragua specifically because that's where we saw the greatest potential to help people. And we'll go in and we'll teach beekeepers. We'll give a beekeeper 2 hives, but we're not giving them the 2 hives. We expect them within 2 years to split those 2 hives and give us 2 hives back. And then we give those 2 hives to somebody else. So they aren't just getting a gift, they're having to repay us, and then we're giving the repayment to someone else in their community. So it's a good way to make beekeepers out of people that we are teaching beekeeping. For those of you who maybe aren't up in your geography, Nicaragua is in Central America, obviously, and it's above Costa Rica, a very touristy type of country, below 3 countries that are less safe to travel in. It's a very safe country to be working in. It's a very beautiful country, and the United States has had a mixed relationship with Nicaragua through the Somoza regime and through the Contra wars, but the people of Nicaragua are really like Americans. Back in the early 60s, President Kennedy paired states with Central and South American countries. Wisconsin got paired with Nicaragua. Through the Wisconsin-Nicaragua Partners of the Americas, they do a lot of work in Nicaragua, helping out Nicaraguans. They collect old fire trucks and ambulances from Wisconsin, and the Wisconsin Air National Guard flies them down on C-130s, along with other things that we collect up here to help them with. This last year, I replaced my table saw. And my table saw was the one I replaced it was a Sears Craftsman from the 1950s. It was a beautiful table saw, but it really wasn't worth anything up here. No one wants to buy an old table saw up here. So I donated it to the Partners of the Americas, and they flew it down to Managua on a C-130, and it's being delivered to one of our beekeepers down there who's going to use it to make beehives with. And it's going to have a big effect in his life because he's going to have this tool that he can actually make and sell beehives with. A little piece of history. When I was growing up, I would go through Clintonville and the airport beacon, we'd drive by on the way to my grandma's house. I remember that from my childhood. Well, the Partners had actually taken that down because it wasn't needed in Clintonville anymore, and now it sits on Lake Managua, on the port in Managua. It was a bunch of real fancy restaurants, and this old beacon sits out there on the port, and it's kind of a focal point. But it was kind of cool to see the Clintonville airport beacon down there when I traveled. In Central America, well, in the United States here, we work Northern European hybrids of the Apis mellifera. We have like the Italian honeybees, the Carnolians, the buckfast. They're all Northern European bees. They're very gentle. You can work bees without having gloves on, without having a lot of protective gear, just a veil on at many times of the year. In Central America, they have the Africanized bee that has come up from South America. In Brazil, they brought some Africanized bees over in, I believe it was the 1950s, and some accidentally got out. And basically these Africanized bees, because they're so aggressive, took over all over in South America, and then they moved north. They are actually in the southern United States now. They'll never come this far north because they can't survive the winters up here. This is a video I took a few weeks ago, and it'll kind of give you a feel of what it's like. And it kind of builds on itself, because when they hit your veil, they start depositing venom on your veil, and then they get more excited. And they just keep on and keep on and keep on. And so, you have to be careful that you're very well. This is our translator, Moesis, and for some reason they just don't like him. Generally speaking, he's the one they pick on. He must have had some bees get in through this place right here because he's holding it shut as he's talking. But when you're working in the yard, they just stay on you. And when you work with the bees up here in Wisconsin, a hive gets a little bit upset. You walk away 15 yards or so, and they calm down and they leave you alone. Here, you have to walk for half an hour or an hour through the jungle, and they just stay on you and stay on you and stay on you. And they're so aggressive. But fortunately, it's nothing we have to worry about up here. They don't like cameras. For some reason, they don't like black, and they start bouncing off the cameras, and this little piece in the back of the camera here is rubber, and they start putting their stingers in the rubber, and that smell gets them worked up, and they just cover the camera. Nicaragua is a very beautiful country, a lot of active volcanoes, a great place for the trees are full of orchids, and they grow bananas, cocoa beans, coffee, all kinds of melons. Just everything grows easily down there. This is a volcano on Ometepe Island. We have a couple projects on this island. It's an island in Lake Nicaragua. And actually, this is an orphanage here that was active till about 2011 when this volcano erupted and this whole side of the mountain melted away, and they didn't feel safe leaving kids at this particular location, so they had this huge compound. So they moved all the kids to the mainland, and now they grow plantains and bananas there and do beekeeping there. And a lot of times we'll have to walk for half an hour on trails like this, sometimes carrying beehives, to get back to the people we're training or where we're delivering the hives to. This was a couple years ago. My son Joe here was down there, and this was a reporter from New York One television station doing a documentary on us, Dr. Bauer. This is Francisco, one of our beekeepers down there, who is getting my table saw in a few weeks here, and Moesis, our translator. These two guys here, Moesis and Francisco, and a few other we have down there, they do a lot of work when we're not there. So when we get on the ground in Nicaragua, everything's kind of organized, and we can go out and do training more efficiently. We can use our time a lot better down there than just running around trying to place beehives. So they do a lot of work for us down there. Sometimes we have to work bees at night down there because the bees are so mean that they will fly a half a mile away to find a house, and they don't have windows on their houses down there. So those bees will fly a half a mile to a house, and they'll sting the people in the house because they're so aggressive. So when we're in places where there's a lot of houses nearby, we work them at night, and it's the bees aren't really, are pretty docile at night, but what happens is they fly up in the air, and then you end up with pounds and pounds of bees on your back and head, and you kind of got to brush them off and shake yourself off and kind of de-bee yourself before you get back to the truck, and you can never de-bee yourself. There's always 10 bees left on you. Here, Francisco is training a bunch of new beekeepers. This is kind of neat because now the people we have trained are going out and training beekeepers. That makes a much more efficient use of our time when we're down there. And he's training, these are the beekeepers on that island, Ometepe, who are on the orphanage that was abandoned. Some of the beekeepers we've trained, this is Yarmaleth. She runs a women's cooperative. And we've trained her, and we've worked with her on raising queens, and she's trained a number of women to become beekeepers. That's her and her family. And these are some of the beekeepers on Ometepe we trained. And we have lots of these groups around, and they're just so eager to learn. They're such good students. The politics in Nicaragua, it's a safe place to travel. We take groups with us down there. This time when we were down there, we had 10 people traveling with us, 11 traveling with us as tourists. Some of them were beekeepers, some of them were not beekeepers, but we took them around. It's a very safe country to travel in. Daniel Ortega, who was the head of the Sandinista party, who overthrew the Somoza regime, who was the people we were backing back in the 70s. He's president again now. He just changed the Constitution so he could become president again. And I think after he runs this term, his wife is going to become president. There's a number of parties running against them, but overall their politics works pretty good down there. They are, I guess you would say they're a socialistic nation, but they're very, very capitalistic. We were invited in 2016, my son and I, we got to go to a rally down there, 37th annual celebration of the overthrow of basically the United States. And we had very good seats. We heard Daniel Ortega and his wife speak, and the President Madera from Venezuela speak, and the President of El Salvador and Cuba. And it was very interesting to be in that. You know, this is the Sandinista party flag, and of course Che Guevara, and it was very interesting to be in that. But we were the gringos, and we really stood out. But we got along with everybody just fine. Everybody would just, the coolest thing was everybody wanted to get their picture taken with the gringos. This is my son Joe. And I just love this picture because everybody wanted the picture with the gringos because we were like the oddballs in the whole crowd. And there was probably 1 million people in this plaza that day. So that's pretty much my talk. But if there's one thing to take away from this is our honeybee. It's gentle. It drinks nectar. You'll probably never be stung by a honeybee. This is not our honeybee. You see the yellow. Don't blame us for it. Our honeybee only drinks nectar. And that's my talk. Why
are the hives painted white?
I think it's historically they're painted white to keep them cool. Oh. Fewer and fewer hives nowadays are painted white. I'd say more and more hives are light greens to blend in so they don't stick out quite as much. My hives are painted white because I like the historical look of the hive. But hives are painted everything. You just don't want to paint them dark colors where they absorb too much heat.
But then too, all the beekeepers wear a white colored. Why is that?
Because bees can't see the white. They see reds and blacks and darker colors. So you want a lighter color. You're not as noticeable to them. If you're wearing like the camera, you know, if the camera was black, he got stung up a lot because it was black.
How did you find out that they can't see white?
I don't know. There are some really interesting, I've seen some really interesting videos on what bees actually see. And they see things in slow motion. So if you move slow, they can't see you. And that's why when you're around bees, if you're calm and moving slow, you don't get them riled up. But if you make fast movements, they can see things that move fast, but because they see everything in slow motion. That probably has to be how they can fly and navigate between the flowers going so fast. They slow everything down. I don't know how they figured that out.
What is the native language there? You're talking about the translator. Is it Spanish?
Spanish. It's Spanish. It's a Spanish with a Nicaraguan dialect.
Oh,
so
okay.
if you take someone who knows Mexican Spanish or Spain Spanish, the Spanish, they have a little bit of a hard time with Nicaraguans because they have a little bit of a dialect.
So it's kind of like somebody from America, but they live in Alabama.
Yeah. Or it's kind of like somebody in America and in England. If you ever go to England, it's very hard to understand them.
Right.
I'll ask you another question.
Yeah.
Do you have any antidote for one of those diseases that the bees have or get?
What we're learning more and more now is we're feeding them better and better nutrition. We're learning how to give them better nutrition. We never used to feed pollen supplements to bees, proteins to bees. Now we're feeding a lot of pollen supplements to give them extra protein. We're making sure they have probiotics, things like that we never did years ago. So that's kind of the key to this is giving them better nutrition. The bigger part of the story is to control the mites, to make sure that the mites don't get out of control in hives. That's almost my life's work with trying to make sure that beekeepers understand you have to control the mites, and you can control them with different things. There's hard chemicals that were used for years to control them, which is difficult because you're using an insecticide to kill a bug on a bug. And what happened is that they built up resistance to those synthetic chemicals. And that's kind of, we don't use synthetic chemicals that much anymore. We use organic chemicals like formic acid, oxalic acids, thyme, products that are made from the herb thyme. And we use those a lot to keep the mite counts down in the hives. And we're constantly checking for mites. We can do, there's a procedure we can do in a hive to release mites from bees, and we can count how many mites there are per 100 bees. And when they get over a certain amount of mites per 100, then we start treating the bees to make sure they're under control. So it's treating for mites, it's giving them better nutrition.
So if you had a garden and you had your hive in the middle of the garden, would it help to grow thyme around your beehive?
I don't know, it might, but I wouldn't think that would be the first line of defense. They're doing work with that though, with thyme and also oregano. Bees that work oregano get certain types of antimicrobial benefits from that oregano nectar.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying no, but it's not something that we use primarily now.
Have you been stung a lot yourself?
Not really. I mean, more than you, probably. But I mean, some days I'll get 20 stings, and then I'll go 2 weeks without getting stung, and then I'll get stung up real good. It really isn't, you don't get stung as much as you think.
Reaction to
No, someone says you should be stung about 200 times a year in order to keep healthy, response to stings. I don't think I get stung 200 times a year. I mean, I could, but I don't.
I did not realize that you were a beekeeper. I knew Keith was. How many years have you been doing this?
40 years.
Really?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's fantastic.
It's fun. It's fun. It's definitely
really beneficial.
Tell us something about the ground bees that are mean, but how do you tell the difference? I know you're not supposed to move too fast, but
most native bees are solitary bees, and they don't organize themselves in colonies. But like, if we say, for example, the wasps that are in the ground, again, I don't know a whole lot about them. They don't winter. I know that the queens winter somewhere, but the bees basically die off. But most bees are solitary bees in that they don't have colonies together. Bumblebees, for example, though, are kind of a little bit different. Bumblebees build little wax cells like honeybees, little wax pots, and they have colonies of maybe 100 bumblebees in the colony, and they'll actually store nectar, but they don't winter through the winter. They reestablish themselves every spring. I think there's, gosh, I forget the number, but it's like 20,000 varieties of native bees, and a lot of them haven't even been named yet.
Really?
I mean, I don't know if it's 20, but it's some huge number like that.
Wow.
What species of bee do they use down in Nicaragua?
It's the same Apis
It
mellifera,
is.
but their origin is Africa and the African continent.
Well, okay, now how about the ones that came from Africa? Do they raid the tame bee or the bees that?
Yes. What they do is they're very aggressive. They'll move into a more docile colony like a northern European bee, and they'll actually take the colony over. And also they swarm so much more that they just outpropagate all the northern European bees.
So what about the specialized raising of the queens? Is that, I mean, how does that happen? Because I thought queens needed the bees and the bees needed the queens.
Right, what you do when you raise queens is you set a hive up that's queenless, that needs a queen, okay? These bees are in that hive, so they're ready to raise a queen. What you do is you take a one-day-old larva with a little spoon out of the cell. So when a queen lays an egg, it's an egg for 3 days. it hatches on the 4th day. On that 4th day, you want to put that larva in a special queen cup. You actually scoop it out and you put it in the queen cup, and then you put that queen cup in a hive that wants to raise a queen. And you won't usually put in one, you'll put in 21 of them or so. And then they will feed that larva more royal jelly. And that's the only thing that determines the queen is the amount of royal jelly. They'll feed that a ton of royal jelly, and then it'll be capped over on the 9th day, and then it'll hatch out on the 16th as a queen. Oh, thanks. So it is a specialized whole part of the bee business. In Northern California, there's people that just specialize in queen rearing, same in the southern United States. And that's where a lot of the work is being done now with genetics. Bees that are super grooming bees, so they groom out the mites, they get rid of the mites, and they're not as susceptible to the viruses that the mites vector into them. And so they have special hives that they take these larvae from and put them into the hives that'll raise new queens. And then you got to be sure that when you put them in that hive, the first queen that hatches, if you don't have that queen cell out there, the first queen that hatches will go and kill all the other queens. So on the 15th day, you have to pull out all those queen cells and put them in individual little hives. So then the queen can hatch out in a little bitty hive, and then she'll go out and get mated from that point. And then after she's mated, she comes back, she starts to lay eggs, and you go in and see that you have a laying queen. And then they capture those queens, and they put them in little wooden boxes. And then those little wooden boxes we use to introduce them to hives. For example, on May 1st, I have 50 queens coming from Northern California. I'll use those 50 queens to take my hives, split them in two, introduce a new queen in there. But it's a very specialized business, and I have a ton of respect for those people out there, and they're a big part of the equation of keeping the honeybee healthy.
So when you're teaching in Nicaragua, then you're not only teaching them how to raise the bees, have a healthy hive, get the honey out, but someone has to be taught then about the queens too.
Yeah, and down in Nicaragua, we do teach some people queen rearing, but more often we teach them how to split a hive. And when you split a hive, if you do it correctly, they will raise the new split will raise their own queen right there. You don't have to transfer that larva. It's a little bit more of a simplified method. But there is a kind of a trick to make sure it's right. You need young bees to raise that queen.
The queens are a larger bee, aren't they, if you will?
Yeah.
Are they like twice the size as a regular?
They're a little bit longer. Gosh, I probably have a picture of that. Yeah, I probably have a picture of that on here. Bear with me a second. But yeah, they're longer. And
and the other question I had is Monsanto Chemical Company, are they producing these bad things for bees?
yes. Interestingly enough, though, they're also working to help the bee. They have hired one of the best beekeepers in the country, Jerry Hayes, and they started a center for the honeybee health. And they're doing things, and some beekeepers say it's propaganda, and some people think it's good. I don't have an opinion either way. I'm glad they're at least trying to help the beekeepers. See if I can find a picture of the beekeeper.
What is the chemical they're producing? That's bad.
The neonicotinoids. And there's several different types of neonicotinoids. So people say ban neonics, and we hear that a lot in the world, that we should be banning these chemicals. But the problem with that is that the chemical companies, Monsanto and Bayer, are actually one step ahead. So if we ban neonics, they have another chemical that's very similar.
Yeah.
So there's always something that's coming along there. I hope they have a queen picture, maybe not.
Is that in that Roundup weed killer that's been recalled? Because it's been known now to cause cancer. The Roundup
Roundup
weed killer stuff that they were spraying on everything?
Roundup isn't really, well, I don't have a strong feeling on Roundup. I mean, I think it's been maybe proven it causes cancer, and we use way too much of it because we create Roundup-ready crops that we can spray the whole crop with Roundup. Yeah. And I guess I don't want to come down too hard on farmers, because farmers have a right to farm, and they have a right to do things what they feel is efficient. But I think we use far too much Roundup. But it's kind of a separate class of chemicals. That's an herbicide that basically kills the weeds between the plants.
The bees that store the honey, are they the same ones that do the wax, make the wax and stuff, or is that separate?
Yes. Gosh.
And how do they make the wax?
Bees have different, I thought I had a picture of this, but I don't have it on this computer. I should have already come prepared if I would have had so many good questions. Bees, when they're born, their first job is house cleaning. And then the second job is feeding young bees or young larvae, okay? And making sure the larva is fed. And then the next job is producing wax. They actually secrete the wax particles through glands on their abdomen. So they eat the nectar, and then they secrete the wax particles, and then the bees take those wax particles and shape them into cells. And then as they go on, they become defensive guard bees, and then they go on to become foragers. That's the last job before they die, is they're foragers. So it's the same bees, but it's a different point in their life.
And it's a 42-day lifespan?
In the summertime, we have, about a 42-day lifespan.
Incredible.
But we have different for bees in the winter. Come late August and September, the bees raise what's called winter bees. They're bees that have a higher fat body content, and they can live 6-7 months. So the bees that are right now in Wisconsin, that are in my hives, were born last September. And they'll start to change over now into summer bees in a few weeks.
Wow. So you
They actually
save a
know.
few of your hives, you don't send them all to California?
I have a few here, yeah.
So the ones in North California, do they make almond honey, or don't they make honey at all?
They build up on the almond crop, but they really don't make any surplus. And I've heard almond honey is not very good. Some people have extremely tasted it, but I heard it's not very good.
But they don't harvest it?
They don't harvest it out there, no.
So you just, it's more or less keeping the bees alive?
Keeping the bees going, and then, and then pollinating it, obviously. Mhm. Good, well, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Reaction to.
No, someone says you should be sung about 200 times a year in order to keep healthy, response to stings. I don't think I get stung 200 times a year. I mean, I could, but I don't.
I did not realize that you were a beekeeper. I knew Keith was. How many years have you been doing this?
40 years.
Really?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's fantastic.
It's fun. It's definitely.
It's really beneficial.
Tell us something about the ground bees that are mean, but how do you tell the difference? I know you're not supposed to move too fast, but.
Most native bees are solitary bees, and they don't organize themselves in colonies. But like, say for example, the wasps that are in the ground. Again, I don't know a whole lot about them. They don't winter. I know that the queens winter somewhere, but the bees basically die off. But most bees are solitary bees in that they don't have colonies together. Bumblebees, for example, though, are kind of a little bit different. Bumblebees build little wax cells like honeybees, little wax pots, and they have colonies of maybe 100 bumblebees in the colony, and they'll actually store nectar, but they don't winter through the winter. They reestablish themselves every spring. I think there's, gosh, I forget the number, but it's like 20,000 varieties of native bees, and a lot of them haven't even been named yet.
Really?
I mean, I don't know if it's 20, but it's some huge number like that.
Wow.
What species of bee do they use down in Nicaragua?
It's the same Apis mellifera,
It is.
but their origin is Africa and the African continent.
Well, okay, now how about the ones that came from Africa? Do they raid the tame bee or the bees that?
Yes. What they do is they're very aggressive. They'll move into a more docile colony like a northern European bee, and they'll actually take the colony over. And also they swarm so much more that they just outpropagate all the northern European bees.
So what about the specialized raising of the queens? Is that, I mean, how does that happen? Because I thought queens needed the bees and the bees needed the queens.
Right. What you do when you raise queens is you set a hive up that's queenless, that needs a queen. Okay, these bees are in that hive, so they're ready to raise a queen. What you do is you take a one-day-old larva with a little spoon out of the cell. So when a queen lays an egg, it's an egg for 3 days. It hatches on the 4th day. And that 4th day, you want to put that larva in a special queen cup. You actually scoop it out, and you put it in the queen cup, and then you put that queen cup in a hive that wants to raise a queen. And you won't usually put in one, you'll put in 21 of them or so. And then they will feed that larva more royal jelly. And that's the only thing that determines the queen is the amount of royal jelly. They'll feed that a ton of royal jelly, and then it'll be capped over on the 9th day, and then it'll hatch out on the 16th as a queen. Oh, thanks. So it is a specialized whole part of the bee business. In Northern California, there's people that just specialize in queen rearing, same in the southern United States. And that's where a lot of the work is being done now with genetics. Bees that are super grooming bees, so they groom out the mites, they get rid of the mites, and they're not as susceptible to the viruses that the mites vector into them. And so they have special hives that they take these larvae from and put them into the hives that'll raise new queens. And then you got to be sure that when you put them in that hive, the first queen that hatches, if you don't have that queen cell out there, the first queen that hatches will go and kill all the other queens. So on the 15th day, you have to pull out all those queen cells and put them in individual little hives. So then the queen can hatch out in a little bitty hive, and then she'll go out and get mated from that point. And then after she's mated, she comes back, she starts to lay eggs, and you go in and see that you have a laying queen. And then they capture those queens, and they put them in little wooden boxes. And then those little wooden boxes we use to introduce them to hives. For example, on May 1st, I have 50 queens coming from Northern California. I'll use those 50 queens to take my hives, split them in two, introduce a new queen in there. But it's a very specialized business, and I have a ton of respect for those people out there, and they're a big part of the equation of keeping the honeybee healthy.
So when you're teaching in Nicaragua, then you're not only teaching them how to raise the bees, have a healthy hive, get the honey out, but someone has to be taught then about the queens too.
Yeah, and down in Nicaragua, we do teach some people queen rearing, but more often we teach them how to split a hive. And when you split a hive, if you do it correctly, they will raise the new split will raise their own queen right there. You don't have to transfer that larva. It's a little bit more of a simplified method. But there is a kind of a trick to make sure it's right. You need young bees to raise that queen.
The queens are a larger bee, aren't they, if you will?
Yeah.
Are they like twice the size as a regular?
They're a little bit longer. Gosh, I probably have a picture of that. Yeah, I probably have a picture of that on here. Bear with me a second. Yeah, they're longer. And
the other question I had is Monsanto Chemical Company, are they producing these bad things for bees?
Yes. Interestingly enough, though, they're also working to help the bee. They have hired one of the best beekeepers in the country, Jerry Hayes, and they started a center for the honeybee health. And they're doing things, wow. And some beekeepers say it's propaganda, and some people think it's good. I don't have an opinion either way. I'm glad they're at least trying to help the beekeepers. See if I can find a picture of the beekeeper.
What is the chemical they're producing? That's bad.
The neonicotinoids. And there's several different types of neonicotinoids. So people say ban neonics, and we hear that a lot in the world, that we should be banning these chemicals. But the problem with that is that the chemical companies, Monsanto and Bayer, are actually one step ahead. So if we ban neonics, they have another chemical that's very similar. Yeah. So there's always something that's coming along there. If they have a queen picture, maybe not.
Is that in that Roundup weed killer that's been recalled? Because it's been known now to cause cancer. The Roundup.
Yeah, Roundup.
Weed killer stuff that they were spraying on everything.
Roundup isn't really. Well, I don't have a strong feeling on Roundup. I mean, I think it's been maybe proven it causes cancer, and we use way too much of it because we create Roundup-ready crops that we can spray the whole crop with Roundup. Yeah. And I guess I don't want to come down too hard on farmers because farmers have a right to farm and they have a right to do things what they feel is efficient. But I think we use far too much Roundup. But it's kind of a separate class of chemicals. That's an herbicide that basically kills the weeds between the plants.
Okay. The bees that store the honey, are they the same ones that do the wax, make the wax and stuff, or is that separate?
Yes. Gosh.
And how do they make the wax?
Bees have different. I thought I had a picture of this, but I don't have it on this computer. I should have already come prepared if I would have had so many good questions. Bees, when they're born, their first job is house cleaning. And then their second job is feeding young bees or young larvae, okay? And making sure the larva is fed. And then the next job is producing wax. They actually secrete the wax particles through glands on their abdomen. So they eat the nectar, and then they secrete the wax particles, and then the bees take those wax particles and shape them into cells. And then as they go on, they become defensive guard bees, and then they go on to become foragers. That's the last job before they die, is they're foragers. So it's the same bees, but it's a different point in their life.
And it's a 42-day lifespan?
In the summertime, we have, about a 42-day
That's
lifespan.
incredible.
But we had different bees in the winter. Come late August and September, the bees raise what's called winter bees. They're bees that have a higher fat body content, and they can live 6-7 months. So the bees that are right now in Wisconsin, they're in my hives, were born last September. And they'll start to change over now into summer bees in a few weeks.
Wow. So you
They actually
save a
know.
few of your hives, you don't send them all to California?
I have a few here, yeah.
So the ones about California, do they make almond honey, or don't they make honey at all?
They build up on the almond crop, but they really don't make any surplus. And I've heard almond honey's not very good. Some people have extremely tasted it, but I heard it's not very
But
good.
they don't harvest it?
They don't harvest it out there, no.
So you just, it's more or less keeping the bees alive?
Keeping the bees going, and then, and then pollinating it, obviously. Mhm. Good, well, thanks for having me.
Thank you.